All right, let's begin. Today, we're going to look at two of the most significant challenges of our time: climate change and economic inequality. Now, while we often discuss these as separate problems, we're going to explore how they're actually caught in a reinforcing cycle where each one makes the other worse. Understanding this structural link is absolutely critical. And this statement here from the Economics Observatory really gets to the heart of our analysis today. It suggests we can't really solve one of these issues if we ignore the other. So let's start by digging into how exactly this connection works. First up, let's look at the initial part of this cycle: how poverty and a lack of economic security can actually contribute to environmental damage. This, in turn, helps set the stage for the much wider impacts of climate change. You see, for many communities in poverty, particularly those who rely on farming, day-to-day survival is the main priority. This can lead to an over-reliance on scarce natural resources. Without access to modern farming techniques that preserve soil fertility, land can get depleted, which then forces people to clear new land, and that often means deforestation. And what makes this even tougher is a lack of capital and modern infrastructure. A reliance on things like firewood for energy speeds up that deforestation. On top of that, when people have limited access to finance, they can't invest in things that could really help, like better sanitation, irrigation, or more sustainable farming. It effectively traps them in a cycle of straining their own environment. Okay, so we've seen one side of the coin, now let's flip it around. We're going to examine how climate change hits poorer nations the hardest, which then worsens the very economic inequalities that we just saw can contribute to environmental pressure. For this part of our discussion, a lot of the analysis comes from the work of Jonathan Colmer at the Economics Observatory, and what he demonstrates is that both socially and economically disadvantaged groups are the most exposed to a changing climate, and they're also the least able to cope with its consequences. This really highlights a key idea: relative impact. Extreme weather events happen all over the world, but their economic and social damage is just so much greater in developing countries. This is often because these nations simply have fewer resources and less resilient infrastructure to handle and recover from these kinds of shocks. And here's a pretty stark number to back that up. According to research that Colmer cites, global warming has already had a measurable effect on global inequality. Because of temperature-driven economic losses, which happen mostly in poorer, hotter countries, the income gap between the world's richest and poorest tenths is estimated to be 25% larger than it would have been without climate change. So why does that happen? Well, this chart shows us a crucial economic reason. Research has found that the relationship between temperature and productivity isn't a straight line. As you can see, economic productivity seems to peak at an average annual temperature of about 13 degrees Celsius. But as temperatures get higher than that, productivity drops off, and quite sharply. And since many developing economies are in hotter climates to begin with, they feel the biggest economic drag from rising global temperatures. Right, so we've talked about the gap between countries. But this isn't just a story about rich nations versus poor nations. This same dynamic of climate-driven inequality is playing out with just as much force within individual countries, making the existing divides between their own citizens even deeper. And this leads to what we can call a vulnerability trap. Think about it. The most vulnerable people in a society have the fewest means to protect themselves from things like hurricanes or severe heat waves. So when a disaster does hit, they tend to lose a larger portion of their wealth and have fewer resources to get back on their feet. This just makes their economic situation worse, which in turn makes them even more vulnerable to the next event. It's a vicious cycle. Here's a really clear, tangible example of this vulnerability trap in the context of education. Studies have shown that higher temperatures have a negative effect on student learning and test scores. But, and this is the key part, these effects basically disappear in schools that have air conditioning. So this means climate change can directly harm the educational outcomes for children in poorer districts, making existing inequalities worse from a very early age. So when you see how deeply interconnected all of this is, you realize it creates a profound challenge for policymakers. How do you design policies that actually work to fight climate change, but without putting an even heavier burden on the very people who are least responsible for the problem and most affected by it? And that really is the central policy question, isn't it? Many of the standard economic solutions, like a tax on carbon, can raise the price of essential things like energy and transport. These costs are what we call regressive. They take a bigger percentage of income from lower-income households, and that can, understandably, create political backlash and deepen inequality. So one solution that's often proposed is to pair a carbon tax with a system of redistribution. Let's walk through it. First, the tax is put in place, raising the price of emissions and giving everyone an incentive to use less. But the crucial part is the next step. The money that's collected from that tax is then returned directly to citizens, usually as a lump sum transfer, so a fixed payment to every household. For lower income families, this payment can offset or even be more than the higher energy costs, making the policy progressive while still achieving its environmental goals. And we'll end on this powerful concluding thought from the source material. It's a really stark reminder that we're not looking at two separate crises here, but two sides of the same fundamental challenge. Any attempt to solve one while ignoring the other is probably destined to fail. To break this vicious cycle, we have to address them together. It's not just a moral imperative, it's a strategic one.